Hi everyone, this is Will de Beaurepaire from de Beaurepaire Wines. I'd like to welcome you to a virtual wine tasting which we've put together for the Crowne Plaza Changi Airport. We've selected 3 wines that we believe you will enjoy that pair beautifully with a selection of Singaporean food you've been provided with and reflect the incredible diversity of our winery. As you can see from this opening slide, we've got a lush, verdant, beautiful vineyard in the mountains just west of Sydney. And I'll start talking you through the winery as we go. I'd like to give you a little bit of background about our wines, about our approach to winemaking, our family history and the connection it has with France. But let's first of all start with who are we? So we are a small family winery. We're established in 1998 by my parents, Richard and Janet. My sister now is involved in the winery, and we're hopeful that the next generation, my children, will take up the mantle many years in future. We are a terroir-focused French-style producer. I'll talk a little bit about what that means, but effectively we are focused on bringing out the French heritage that we have. We are originally from Burgundy. Our family still resides there. They actually live in the same home they've lived in for nearly 900 years. And the name, our surname, actually has a translation in French. Beau means good or beautiful, and repair means hideaway. And I think we've also created a little bit of that here in Australia. In 2018, out of 10,000 wines judged, we were named Australian Wine of the Year and also Best Australian and New Zealand Sweet Wine. We'll look forward to explaining this as we go along. A little bit about our ethos. As you can see here, it's a beautiful picture of our vineyard in winter. I think it was about -9 degrees at the time I took this photo. But at the bottom is our quote, and this is effectively what we stand for. As stewards of our land and honouring our Burgundian forebears, we pursue a French winemaking style, an elegant, balanced and age-worthy style that captures the exceptional character of our special limestone-based terroir, celebrating the variations of each vintage with a minimum of intervention and using regenerative viticultural techniques. Rather than just sustainable, we believe it's important to rebuild and renew. So what are we talking about when we're talking about our vineyard and we're talking about terroir? As you may have discovered, when you hear a lot about wine, and especially from Australia, we talk a lot about temperature, cool climate versus warm climate, and the influence that has on wine quality. In reality, the temperature is more important from a varietal selection. When we're talking varietal selection, we're talking whether it's be French varieties or Spanish varieties or Italian varieties, but also within those countries themselves. So in France, are we talking Bordeaux varieties, so Cabernet, Merlot, or Semillon? Or are we talking Burgundian varieties like Chardonnay and Pinot, which are also shared by the Champagne region? We obviously were looking for a cool climate area because we were trying to replicate Burgundy and a little bit of Bordeaux there as well. And you can see the French regions have been identified by their light blue. And then you see the incredible diversity of the rest of Australia by temperature. But this is very one-dimensional and doesn't capture the entire picture. In particular, as we go through this, I'll explain how the French view terroir, how our family does in France, and what we've tried to replicate here in Australia. What is terroir? So terroir is the combination of that temperature we talked just about before and the climate. So whether it's maritime, by the coast, or continental, inland, the topography, you know, are you on a hill? Are you in a valley? Are you on the slope? The grape varieties, as we talked about, you know, how they interplay with all of this, the soil, which is incredibly important, and the flora and fauna around the vineyard and within the vineyard. So what actually are you planting between the rows is now becoming increasingly important, especially from a regenerative perspective. But what's most important about the French approach to viticulture and to vineyards is that there is no French term for winemaker. The French use the term vigneron, which is explaining their connection to the vineyard. If you do hear them speaking in and translating that word or their role into English, you might hear them calling themselves a wine grower. So rather than a winemaker, they believe that 80 to 90% of the wine is made in the vineyard. And that's the reason why they have their appellation system, which I'm sure some of you may be aware about, where it goes from Grand Cru, Premier Cru, down to Vin de Pays and the like, all with commensurately reducing prices along the way. So when we started looking around, our family first started producing wine in Australia in 1970 in the Yarra Valley, which is just north and northeast of Melbourne in the state of Victoria. We started looking around going, this is not Burgundy. It's a beautiful wine region. It's magnificent, makes spectacular wines. We were looking for areas that were probably a little bit more associated in style and type and terroir of the terroir to Burgundy. And you'll notice on this chart, it's not a map, is you've got on the vertical axis that same temperature dispersal that we were showed on the first, of hot, warm regions down to cool regions at the bottom. But you've noticed that it's concertinaed, it's opened up across this horizontal axis. And that's driven by soil type. And on the scale, remembering our school chemistry, on the left is acidic soils, which is the natural state that most soils are. They're normally quite acidic. That's a function of rainfall, but also a lot of volcanic rock. Out across to the right, which are alkaline or mildly, so neutral to mildly alkaline soils, which are very different to acidic soils. And you'll notice very quickly that all the French regions fit within this box on the right, which is mildly alkaline soils, relatively cool. And here you're talking about regions, maybe if you follow the pointer on, that have quite substantially different wines. Bordeaux has its big and bold reds, especially Cabernets, and Burgundy has its elegant and mouth-watering Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs. Yet on this chart, they are quite similar. The big difference, defining feature between them is where they're located in France. But then you look at the greater level of this chart and you see all these other wine regions of Australia. These are all premium regions. They're all making magnificent wine, but they're not going to be making it in the French style. And that's completely fine. There is always new methods and styles of wine to be discovered. There are different mixes of terroir and varieties that are underway. But for us, honoring our forebears, following the terroir of Burgundy in particular, but of France in generality, was important to us. So we look at a very potentially confusing little picture, and it's made intentionally so to an extent, but I've drawn some fairly important lines onto the map of France. So to understand their vineyards and to understand the way they make their wine, you first must start at the country scale. When you see a big circle on the outside, a little circle on the inside, and some dotted lines, black lines, so effectively a bullseye on the region of Burgundy, which you'll notice very quickly how far it is away from La Manche or the English Channel, the Atlantic Ocean or the Mediterranean. And you'll then also see these purple ellipses, which are incredibly important and actually are probably one of the most important controlling features of where vineyards are planted in France, especially the quality ones. But we'll start with the first one. So the first circle, the little red zone in the middle, that shows Burgundy. It's where it's located. Once again, you can see the distance from the coastline, but you also see that it's located in this dark green area. This is a climate map of France. And if you follow it across, you'll see this influence continental, or climat, continental climate. And that's really important for those of you who've spent time inland in the countries that you visited, a long way from the ocean. You'll notice that the days can be hot, the nights can be very cool. Soil and land is a very poor retainer of heat, whereas in Singapore and on the coastal towns around Sydney, you have the ocean, which regulates temperature, which is great in keeping the temperature cooler on a hot day, and it's great in keeping the temperature warmer on a cool day, but it tends to stop the radical shifts that occur when you move further inland, further away from the coastline. And so Burgundy is very much that. Hot days, cold nights. It's really important. From a viticultural perspective, they are plants, remembering high school biology here, photosynthesis, which is effectively the engine room of the vines and all plants, which create the sugar within the berries. And that sugar is important because that sugar becomes the alcohol. And that alcohol has a large part to play in the wine, but it's not the only thing. You also need to develop flavor and tannin ripeness. Tannin ripeness we can come back to a little bit at the end, but you see tannins are probably most pronounced in a big red. They feel like cat's tongue on the inside of the jaw. But flavor is something we can really get our heads around, is you're really looking for something that's ripened its flavor, and that doesn't always happen in line with the sugar. And so with these warm days, the sugar ripeness streams ahead thanks to photosynthesis. Then the cold nights slow that horse down and enable the flavor ripeness to catch up. And that's where it's really important, especially for Burgundy with the varieties that they are. They're quite thin-skinned as well. And you find that slowing down the quite cold nights can also be quite confronting, quite difficult for the grape. They are a living organism. They are naturally going to protect the seeds, the progeny, their young, so to speak. So they thicken the skins up. And those thicker skins are also important because if you take rosé is red wine without skin. So skins is where you get a lot of your flavor and a lot of your color from. So this continental climate with Pinot and Chardonnay, but Pinot in particular, is really important because it thickens those skins, gives more color, gives more flavor, more structure to the wine. If it's grown on the coast, you get a much lighter expression of Pinot Noir. So you can see on the right there, obviously the temperature shifting quite a lot during the day to night period. So that's important. So we've said cold climate at the start. Now we're moving to inland cold climate, so continental cold climate. But that doesn't define Burgundy perfectly. This here is a vineyard map of Burgundy. It shows where the vineyards are planted, and you'll straight away notice something. One, it's 60 kilometers long, but it's very narrow. The best bits of Burgundy can even get down to as narrow as half a kilometer. If it was temperature and inland location, the expectation would be that Burgundy would have vineyards everywhere. The price alone demands more planting of vines, but they don't. They're very constrained. And this is the secret ingredient of Burgundy's viticulture, but also France's in general. And it all starts with maps like this, which are getting even more colorful. This is a geological map of France. The way to look at it, probably in entirety, is I've traced out the wine regions around. You can see Loire Valley here. You can see Burgundy here in black, Champagne in yellow. You can see the Rhone Valley down here in white. A little bit hard to see. You see maybe Provence, famous for its rosés, right down here in the bottom. Bordeaux over here, and the Loire Valley with all its beautiful castles along there. But the big two things I want to draw your eye to, I've made it pretty obvious, is these two basins, the Paris Basin and the Aquitaine Basin. And they are critical because effectively they define where the vineyards are going to be located. And what they are, the way to think of them is that 150 million years ago, we're talking the Jurassic era, those remember the movie series, the continents of the world were combined into a supercontinent called Pangaea. And as it started to break apart, the water from the ocean surrounding it rushed in to fill the low points, to fill the valleys. And those low points included the Paris Basin and the Aquitaine Basin. But we'll talk here about the Paris Basin because it's in front of us. And this formed a very shallow, very warm sea. Europe or France at that time was located around the equator, teeming with sea life. And this is what created the feature that defines Burgundy, which is the soils. And this is the same actually for all the French regions. And if you remember that initial chart, which showed the soil alkalinity or acidity, this is what also creates that alkaline. So if you're looking here at the top, I've pulled it apart. So you've got plankton. So plankton, obviously, it's what whales still eat these days. They were in such density in this shallow sea that as they died, they dropped to the bottom of the ocean and they built up these layers of chalk. And those of you who have been to Champagne will know when you see the calves, the the cellars within which the great maisons have their champagne stored, you'll see there's an incredible amount. They're cut right into the chalk. In Burgundy and also in the Loire Valley and in the right bank of Bordeaux, they were right on the coastline. So Champagne was off in the water, but on the coastlines, you obviously had just the same as around Singapore and around Sydney and the like. You had shellfish, oysters and mussels and the like. And those were in such density in the right zones where the water was still, so behind eddies, where there were coral reefs, so which protected them from being washed away. They formed up in quite substantial density, and over the millions of years, in the same way the plankton became chalk, those shellfish became limestone. And that limestone, you can actually see there, so a gentleman, not me, holding up a fossilized shell, and that is in the vineyards of Burgundy. You can actually see the shells in the stone, in the rock, and in the soil. So why limestone? I'm not sure if there are many avid gardeners amongst you, but you'll notice if you've got vegetable gardens, in particular tomatoes, they really don't like acidic soils. Some plants like acidic soils. It's worth looking it up before you just go and start throwing lime onto all your garden beds. But a lot of plants don't like acidic soils. And so the way that gardeners get around that is you throw garden lime on. You throw eggshells. So it's calcium carbonate. So the shells of eggs are the same as the shells of fish. Farmers use it in very large quantities, as you can see here off the back of a tractor, or maybe this gentleman over here just liming his lawns. But the aim, what they're trying to do is they're trying to, as we said, raise that pH, raise that soil pH from 4, 4.5 to 5 down here, trying to get it up to 7, 7.5. Because as you can see here, around that 7, 7.5. So this is where Burgundy and Bordeaux are located in terms of their soil alkalinity or acidity, is a lot more of these minerals are available to the vine. And think of them in the same way that humans need multivitamins, plants need multivitamins too. They do exactly the same function for plants as they do for humans. They assist with their immune response, helps them stay healthier. It helps with their skins, the skin color, the density and the vibrancy of its canopy and leaves. Really critical. So having those multivitamins more accessible equates with a much healthier vine. And what we're trying to get to here is when you're in a situation where the soils, where the nutrients are much more available, much more easily accessible by the vines, it's called a more efficient soil. And you start seeing it here is these things start to play, because like your stomach has a biome, it's full of microorganisms. And as you know, when you have antibiotics, you wipe them out. You've then got to go and have some yogurt or lactobacillus tablets. You need to look after yourself. It takes a while to recover. The same situation is in the soils. Vines have their stomachs on the outside, and they operate in exactly the same fashion. So in these soils, it's teeming with microorganisms whose job it is you can't just take up, a vine doesn't just take up copper or aluminium or iron. It needs to be processed by a microorganism who effectively digest it, secrete it, make it available in it. And this happens much more efficiently in that neutral to mildly alkaline soil. So that healthy biome obviously feeds the vine. There are some other winemaking sort of examples about the yeasts, which are important from the actual production perspective. But the important thing is to realize that healthy, efficient soils make for a healthy, happy vine. But the big thing, when you talk about efficiency, it's much like efficiency in anything. It means you don't need as much of something to get the same outcome. So fuel efficiency means you can get from A to B with less fuel. So efficient soils naturally means you can get the nutrients out of them with less. And this is really important. This is probably the driving feature here, is if you look at this picture here, I'm not sure what they call them. Maybe in Singapore, we call them table grapes. In Australia, grapes you get from the supermarket that you eat, and they're very refreshing. As you can see, though, they're huge. they're full of water. They're not really flavorsome. That's not their purpose. They're for refreshment. But you see on the right of this picture over here, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, they're tiny, much smaller grapes. And what that's demonstrating is that they actually didn't get as much access to water. And that's where those efficient soils are important. Because they're efficient, it means that the vine can be healthy on a fairly shallow soil. Fairly shallow soils mean when it rains, there's not a lot of volume for the moisture to be captured within. Effectively, what you're talking about is talking about that the vine is healthy, but the grapes become water stressed, and that makes the grapes smaller. And what's important there, it goes back to those skins that I talked about. So thicker skins, more flavor, more structure, will take away or reduce the juice, and the concentration increases. So you're getting even more flavor, even more structure into your wine than something like a table grape or a grape that's heavily irrigated or has too much access to water. So you're really talking here about the ability for vineyards to run on shallow soils. And a lot of times, and I sometimes hear it in discussions about wine, as deep soils and discussions about them. It is misleading. That is human psychology. We like to think of ourselves like oak trees, deep-rooted and stable and stoic and strong. The reality is grapes do not need and should not be given for winemaking deep soils. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Here is probably one of the most expensive champagnes in the world, Louis Roederer Cristal. I know it's a Jeroboam, but we're talking almost 17,000 Singapore dollars. But you'll look on the right, this is actually its vineyard, a 50 centimeter deep soil, so very shallow, it's probably the length of your arm. And then below it is that chalk layer, which came from the plankton. So what it shows here as well is not just that they're shallow soils, it shows the proximity to the limestone or the chalk, which is really important because these climates get very cold in winter and then get very warm in summer. And the rocks expand and contract with the heat and the cold. And that gradually shatters them through the soil and spreads that limestone or chalk upwards naturally through the soil. So the way that more acidic soils, as I said, are able to overcome this is they buy a lot of lime, they throw it out there in the vineyard, have to do it every year because it washes away. Problem is it's top down and it doesn't get that deep. The best part of your root zone is probably around 30 to 50 centimeters. That's where you're far enough from the surface. The microorganisms are really working overtime for you down there. And it's in that zone where the limestone layer or the chalk layer below is providing the most influence, which is wonderful. So this is obviously Louis Roederer. It's from Côte de Blanc in Champagne. It's their vineyard, and very shallow. We'll move to the most expensive wine in the world. This is a Burgundian wine. So Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, or DRC, as it's called in the industry. So you can see here, this is a 1989, so it's got some age on it, but not crazy amount of age. And we're talking almost 36,000 Singapore dollars. And you can see its soils on the left, pretty rocky, pretty shallow, nothing very special about them in terms of they're not brown or rich soils. These are soils that the vine is struggling. It's getting the nutrients because of the alkalinity, but it's struggling to get moisture. So the berries get smaller and smaller. And in Burgundy, the defining feature that gets that shallowness of the soil is to do with them being planted on slopes of the hills. And you can see here, obviously, as you go down the slope, this area is called the Grand Cru. So Grand Crus are your premium. So your Domaine Romanée-Conti is a Grand Cru, your Corton Charlemagne's are your Grand Crus. They're Montrachet's, they're very expensive. So there's been erosion, and the erosion has kept the soils at this 30 to 50 centimeter depth. And the soils gradually pull up down the bottom of the hill into the valley where it's called colluvium. The soils get deeper, they get, I think, more lush, and the vines don't struggle to get the water like they do on the mid slopes, and the wine quality diminishes rapidly to the point where you probably wouldn't spend a lot of money on some of these Burgundian wines in the valley. So what we've said here, and this is important because this sets the benchmark for what was our reason for us to go on our hunt for our piece of Burgundy in Australia was, but limestone creates that efficient, neutral alkaline soil, makes a healthy, happy vine. But because the soils are efficient, you can run on very shallow soils. I've said less than 1 meter here, but 50, 60 centimeters is more than enough, as shown by the best wines in the world. That creates these water-stressed, thirsty grapes with smaller berries, more skin to less juice, great for flavor, great for structure. And so the Holy Grail, a bit of a joke, picture on the right, maybe not what he was looking for, or maybe it is. So wine is definitely something worth hunting down. So where do we fit in? You can see here a picture of our vineyard, and you get an understanding. We're in a valley. It's quite a big vineyard. So we've planted 53 hectares. So there's over 100,000 vines here in front in this image here. The vineyard extends about 1.5 kilometers long by about 0.5 kilometer wide. It covers some hills. We're on a slope up here looking down, goes through a small valley, back up over the rise and down into another valley. But why here? Why not the Yarra Valley? So this location where we are is above a little town called Rylstone. It's just over that hill in the background. It's got 900 people. It's a beautiful old 1830s town, stone town, baristas, yoga, art galleries. I call it country light. Definitely easy living, very idyllic, and it's attracted an enormous number of artists, interestingly enough, to this and some of the surrounding towns. But why here? There was no vineyards anywhere near here when we came here 23 years ago. They were 50 kilometers away. My parents made the decision to set up this as a new wine region because their view was that if you pick the right location, the wines will be great. And because the wines are great, you'll bring people to you. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner, where the great slogan in it was "Build it and they will come." That was the mentality they had. It was more important to produce great wine than to be located next to other wineries where we could share and sell it all with traffic, equipment, labor, emotional support. We're very agriculturally exposed here with frosts and hail and bad rains, bushfires. So it's quite lonely, but we went out on our own and we planted this size of the vineyard because it gave us some scale and enabled us to form a fantastic team around us that you couldn't do with a smaller vineyard. And it's also given us the ability to trial many varieties. So we produce 16 different wines off this one property. We don't buy a grape from anywhere else. It's quite an amazing and magical place. And we'll explain a little bit why that is. So always had this little bit of a chart. So we're looking for Burgundy. This is obviously Burgundy in the background. I've added cheekily de Beaurepaire wines. We're 12,742 kilometers away straight down. Unfortunately, we're not located right next to them. We are located 3 hours west of Sydney. So this is an interesting chart. So this is the climate zones of Australia. So zone 8 is high altitude and very low latitude. So you're talking here, the highlands in Tasmania. You're talking here, the snowy mountains in Australia, which are quite substantial, actually bigger than the Alps. They're just not as high, but they still have a lot of snow on them in the middle of winter. Very cold, too cold for viticulture. So when you're talking, you're looking for, depending on the varieties you're looking at, remember that early part of the discussion, are we French varieties? Obviously, you want to be a little bit colder, but if you're Spanish or Southern Italian varieties, you want to be warmer. You want to be in the zone 5 or zone 6 maybe. But zone 7 is France. And you can see that it extends a fair way around. So down in Tasmania, it's to do with latitude. In Victoria, latitude and extent, a little bit of altitude. And in New South Wales, a lot of altitude. And then right up in the border, actually, with Queensland, it gets cold again because it gets very, very high up there. But that gives that really cold French climate. And you can see it here with our lows. This is our average lows. We get to minus 14 degrees Celsius in winter. It's quite brutal, below zero, but this is your average low and our average high over a growing season. So I ignored the winter months. There's no point talking about temperature when the vines are asleep. It's important when they go to bud burst, when they start waking up, and when they go into harvest, then they go to sleep. So you can see So Beaune is the center of Burgundy's wine area, Epernay, obviously Orem in Champagne, Alsace over on the border with Germany, and Bordeaux, southwest France, out by the Atlantic. You can see all their temperatures we're talking about. So we're colder than some, around the same as others, and our highs are around the same. And you start seeing some of the other Australian regions. Interestingly, right down the bottom here is Central Otago, which makes beautiful wine in the South Island of New Zealand. They're very cold. But as you can see here as well is Tasmania, which is well south of where we are, and the island south of Melbourne. Yeah, they're a little bit colder, but about the same temperature as us. That shows ours is altitude, but ours is also soil. So if you remember, we talked about the Pangea breaking apart and the oceans rushing in to fill the Paris Basin, the Aquitaine Basin. So we go a little bit further back, and this is to the Ordovician era. You don't have to remember this, but this is 450 million years ago. And see, Gondwana land was the great southern continent, included Africa, Amazonia, which is obviously parts of South America, South Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia was off here in the far, far, far eastern portion. It was actually broken in two. So you've got Western Australia and part of Eastern Australia over here. And just off that Eastern Australian mega island that was there was this chain of volcanoes. And volcanoes, they created a chain of barrier islands. And that was off the coast. So out on the ocean side, there was quite substantial swells. But on the leeward side, on the side facing towards Gondwana land, were very, very still, calm seas, and along that coastline, you had the creation of a lot of coral reefs, really pure coral reefs, because the main life form in the world at that stage was shellfish. So effectively, you couldn't get more pure limestone from this era, and you can see it here. There's actually you can see that was the barrier chain of islands, those the red stars that sort of run up and down coast. You see them here, and then you see obviously this sort of the tidal zones. You can see some coral reefs here. This is quite an old geological picture, and you can see these limestone deposits which look like tiles or bricks. And Rylstone, which is where we established ourselves, is just here, and it's just off here. The Beaurepaire wines where we picked was right on this big limestone deposit that was right here. It was mixed in with the coral reef. The distance here we're only talking is 1 kilometre wide. So that vineyard I showed you, where it's not that wide. Like in Burgundy, coastlines and shellfish deposits aren't over tens of kilometres. They hug the coastlines. And maybe as the sea moves in and out 50 metres to 100 metres and backwards and forwards over a couple of million years, you're actually able to get a little bit of width to it. But this limestone, so it's very old. It's normally quite deep down. You see it in quite a few of the cave systems. If you've been to Jenolan Caves, west of Sydney's beautiful cave, limestone cave structure, or Wombian caves. But in certain points, it comes to the surface, which is difficult because where Sydney is now at this time, 450 million years ago, it was well out to sea, deep in the ocean. Over the following 200 years, that the land was forced upwards, and that created the Blue Mountains, which is why it's sandstone. Sandstone is obviously stone from the bottom, the depths of the ocean, and that with the volcanoes covered up a lot of this limestone. But in certain points, it reappeared again. And the way that we found it, a lot of people wonder: do you walk around over the thousands of kilometers with a pH testing kit, testing the acidity levels of the soil to find that alkaline soil? You can do that. It would be quite labor intensive, and I don't have enough lifetimes. So what you do is you go looking for cement mines. Cement mining is limestone mining. That's what cement is. It's crushed limestone. And there is probably arguably no more famous historical cement mine than at the little town of Kandos. Kandos has a reputation. Historically, it doesn't produce limestone anymore, but it produced, or at the quarry at Kandos was where they dug out all the limestone to create the cement to build the harbour bridge, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. quite famous, and Candos is right next to Ralston. So we knew that. We went to Candos, Ralston's next door. We found our valley nearby, and the rest is history, I guess. And that's what created this location. We're cold, we're inland, we're 150 kilometers inland, which means we're on the western side of the Great Dividing Range, which is wonderful. We get westerly winds, which protected us from those recent bushfires. The winds of the fires mainly blew away from us. They got close, a couple of kilometers, but most days they were blowing away from us. So we're very fortunate there. It also means the air is quite dry, which is great because it reduces the humidity, which reduces the disease risk. So you're actually not having to do a lot of sort of harmful spraying to manage this vineyard, like you would if you were on the coastal areas where there's a lot more humidity, which pulls up in the canopy and brings in diseases like powdery mildew that you do not want. And then we've got the limestone soil, which gave us this very similar climate and soil type to the Burgundy regions. So that is our overview of our winery. The next step is obviously talking about our wines. And that is one of the best things about wine is that you can almost ignore everything I say from here and just drink it and enjoy it and decide yourself what you think of that wine. But I also find it's really interesting to know what inspires the wine's construction. And in this situation, we've picked out these 3 wines, I think, that show a really interesting reflection of our 16 wines. We produce 4 sparklings, 2 sweet wines, and we produce a number of whites, Bordeaux whites, like a Semillon. But this white here is a Chardonnay, which is the classic white variety of Burgundy. And Burgundy in particular, it's broken up in terms of the most famous areas of Burgundy for Chardonnay production. There's this area called the Côte de Beaune, which you might see it's in this gap here. And you can see maybe some of the names like Chassagne Montrachet and Pouligny Montrachet, incredibly famous, incredibly expensive wines these days. But you've also then got this area which isn't actually located as it is on this plan. It's actually further off to the northwest of Dijon. Is the area called Chablis, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. Very famous for very pure, very clean, very crisp Chardonnays. This is the school of Chardonnay that we've produced here is of the Chablis school. So the aim of Chablis is to produce pure terroir Chardonnays, whereas around the Côte de Beaune, they start enriching them with some of their winemaking choices, not winemaking techniques. So the big difference between, say, a Chablis and a Côte de Beaune is the use of oak. So you're not really using any oak in Chablis. We planted a vineyard, not an oak forest. We want to show the wine in its purest form without any oak between us and it. We also are not looking to add a lot of tannin from the oak. So when you talk tannins, we talked earlier about skin thickness. Skin thickness equates with skin tannin. That's one of the main sources of tannin. When your skins aren't thin, you can mitigate that or fix that up by putting them in oak barrels to get tannin from the wood. It's a different type of tannin. It's quite a bit sharper tannin. It needs a bit more time to settle down, but not so much with this wine here. We're looking for a wine that also retained its acidity. One of the defining features of Chablis is their incredibly high acidity level, that real crispness, that real leanness of the wine. This is what we're looking for here. So the same with us. We left that acidity intact. We didn't reduce it through acid fermentation. For those who want to know the full word, it's malolactic fermentation. We left that malic acid intact. So you end up with this wine which has got beautiful amount of fruit expression, lovely acidity. So the fruit and the acid combine together in your palate and create this really easy drinking experience. It's a wine that a lot of people I know call it a veranda wine. You sit on the veranda and drink a couple of bottles of it. It's beautiful with very creamy dishes. It's beautiful with very light seafood, beautiful with oysters. Think ultra creamy cheeses like brie. It's beautiful just by itself, but it's also really interesting. It's really beautiful with some really fatty meats like tataki and the like, or where the fat and the acid bond together beautifully, or work together beautifully in the mouth. So incredibly versatile wine, something that, you know, I think you in particular will really enjoy with the wine, with the food, or just by itself right now. Very simple, very elegant, and it's named after my ancestor. So the picture on the label is my great grandmother, I think to the power of 10. She was painted for the Paris Salon in 1766, so by one of the Grand Masters of Europe. And you can vaguely make her out in the bottle here, but she herself was the embodiment of elegance, and that was the aim of this wine: elegant and beautiful, and sophisticated as well. You can see over here the Chablis that we're talking about. The next wine that you're going to enjoy is the Ralston Estate Match Point Rosé. So the Ralston Estate is a different brand to our family brand. This is my personal brand I make with a good friend of mine. It's where I get a little bit more artistic license to break out of the French song sheet and experiment. Interestingly enough, my experimentation took me back to France, but it took me back to people or wineries in France, vineyards in France, domains in France that were experimenting themselves. And interestingly enough, there were two wineries in Bordeaux. So rosé is most famous in Provence. It utilizes red varieties like Gamay and Cinsault, which when they produce when you take them through to a red wine, i.e. you leave the skin with the juice to macerate, as it's called, you end up with the best they will produce is a Beaujolais, quite a light red. Whereas obviously Bordeaux is producing Cabernets and Merlots, big reds. So you're starting off with a variety that's got a lot more flavor. And I was intrigued, because there was no point us competing against Provence. They're famous for their very light, very dry rosés. They're not expensive to make. They're probably the cheapest wine to make in the world. And the quality of them is not the defining feature. We're also trying to make wines that go with food, and to match with food, you've got to have flavor. You can't just have a wine that's acidic and light. Great for by the pool, maybe not great for with a food dish. This is what we're looking to do. So I hunted around and I discovered these two rosés you can see here. The one on the left was the main one that I discovered. It's called Chateau Brown, very French name. It was an English wine merchant back in the 1700s. It's a Grand Cru domain or maison house, and which means it's at the top of the tree. And they decided to experiment about 10, 15 years ago by converting just a really small amount of their very fine red wines into rosé to give it a go. And they treated it like a premium white wine. They use oak, unheard of in rosé. They hand selected the grapes. It's pressed lovingly. There's no sanya. There's no reintroduction of off-cut juice from other varieties. And they produce these rosés that sell for substantial sums of money. Interestingly, in London, I think they're getting into the 50 and 60 pounds a bottle, complete opposite of what Provence was doing. And from us as a serious sort of Burgundian mindset, I was thinking, this is where we want to go. I want to create a rosé that has that ability to go with maybe white meats, to even some of the fattier fish, to maybe some of the lighter red meats, wines, effectively food matches that would be a natural with Pinot Noir. In Australia's climate and also Singapore's climate, it's hot. And red wines should be chilled a little bit, but can't be overly chilled or they lose their essence. And white wines for some dishes aren't big enough to match up with the flavors that you're dealing with. So rosé with flavor and structure is perfect. It can be chilled like a white wine, but retains its structure and body like a red. And this was what we were trying to do. We've got a number of 3 and 2 hat restaurants down here in Sydney have used this as a match with great dishes like salmons and ceviches, so kingfish and the like. They're beautiful, as I said, with white meats, lean meats, duck, as well as always a great one with this wine here as well. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. And without anything more to do, I'll move on to the next one. So this here is 2016 Le Chevalier, the Knight, Merlot Cabernet Petit Verdot. This is a classic right bank. We're talking old Bordeaux school red wine. So the right bank of Bordeaux has relatively shallow soils, a lot of clay in them. It's the terrain of Merlot. So whereas Cabernet is more Medoc, it's the old drained swamps. The Dutch came in about 400 years ago and drained the swamps, left a lot of river gravels, deep soils. Cabernet could handle very thick skins. It doesn't swell and burst when there's a heavy rainfall. Whereas the Merlot is more from most famous, you'll see it around Pomerol. The most famous Merlot blend is Chateau Petrus, expensive Grand Vin of France. And that was the direction for this wine. So this is a wine that was developed alongside the cultural dish of Bordeaux, of that region. It's called Pauillac lamb, and it's a 45-day aged lamb. So the purpose of what I'm trying to get at is it doesn't have fat. It's incredibly tender meat, very young meat. It's appellation controlled. No one else in the world is allowed to do the same thing. Probably wouldn't want to. But what it means is that that was their main dish. The wine that went with it evolved to be complementary to it. It doesn't need the tannins of Cabernet. It's much warmer, much more lush. It's looking for flavor matching, not the tannins to break down the oils and the fats. That's already happened, especially in the cooking processes that go with this type of wine. So anything braised, baked, slow cooked, stewed, things in curries and the like, where the meat and the proteins have started to break down, the oils and fats have started to break down. Merlot is a beautiful position. It's a warm, welcoming wine. I call it my Sunday roast wine. It's a really easy wine to drink, and it's really based around that right bank Bordeaux. So majoritarily Merlot, which works right in the middle of the palate. You have a bit of Cabernet to activate the front of the palate with its acidity, and the back of the palate with its tannin. As I said, those very thick skins generate the tannin load in in Cabernet Sauvignon in particular. These are the three of our wines that we've selected. I hope you enjoy them. I hope you get to sit back and enjoy them with the food that's been prepared. If you are interested, I know that they're on sale at the hotel, but if you get the chance and you come to Australia, you'll see us ranged at a lot of the top restaurants here and increasingly also around the world. We're the wine partner of Tourism France for Australia, and we do a lot with a lot of the great hotels you'll probably be staying in. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to chatting in the next segment. I'm sure we'll keep discussing about various things, all things wine and all things food and wine. Thank you very much. Cheers.